I'm already starting to notice my age. For a variety of reasons, from the internet to phones and insults, but most relevant to this video, Call of Duty. Growing up, this World War II FPS franchise was just that. It was acclaimed, polished, and very popular within the gaming community. Yet, unlike Grand Theft Auto or Halo, it wasn't taking up Times Square or TV spots. But since 2007, I've seen Call of Duty mentioned by parents, actors, musicians, comedians, Alex Jones, and virtually every news network known to man. There's an entire generation of players whose memory cannot recall a time where Call of Duty didn't exist at the forefront of gaming and arguably pop culture, year after year. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was the title that catapulted this franchise into the mainstream, and no one had any idea that it would. Least of all, the people behind it. World War II has nearly as many media depictions as it had battles. There is not enough time on Mother Earth to consume all the books, comics, plays, shows, films, and games taking place in humanity's greatest conflict. But of all those who've worked on these depictions, one man is to be argued as the most influential, and not just for the reason most are thinking. Because if you are one of the many who expressed their exhaustion of World War II games, part of your displeasure can be attributed to this man's involvement with EA's Medal of Honor. The franchise's current irrelevance may have eroded the history of its initial importance, but in the context of 1999, it was an authentic World War II FPS that sold over 1 million copies on the PlayStation under a major publisher. Multiple industry innovations stem from this title, and of course, ultimately gave the platform for the team at 2015 Incorporated to make Allied Assault, and iterate that game's success under Activision with Call of Duty. But that was only the result, not the original idea. Because when Infinity Ward pitched to Activision, it was for a game depicting modern warfare. Grant Collier, Jason West, and Vince "The Internet Doesn't Have Me" Pin Zampella might have founded one of the most recognizable studios and franchises in gaming history. But they're the opposite of boastful, expressing themselves through the games they create rather than telling the world their stories. As a result, all that's left of Call of Duty 4's development and its studio are pieces, scattered across all variety of articles, previews, books, and most importantly, interviews taking place many moons after this game shipped. But while the narrative assembled here isn't complete, it confirms that Infinity Ward's formation wasn't a middle finger to EA. In fact, the two parties were colluding, at least according to 2015's boss. Company CEO Tom Kaderka didn't get to enjoy Allied Assault's success, because from late December to the game's release on January 20th, he received a resignation letter every day until all but 5 of his staff remained. Feeling, in his own words to Vanity Fair, screwed over, he returned a favor and sued the trio, alleging that Zampella orchestrated a deal with EA through local meetings that covered everything from projects to pensions. When asked, all Jason West had to say about the situation years later was, "Things happened." Though it's unlikely such events would have occurred had there not been a serious opportunity at stake, and there was, a sequel to Allied Assault. Medal of Honor's dominance, and now acclaim on a new platform no less, would virtually guarantee the newly established Infinity Ward another hit. However, there was hesitation, mostly from their previous collaboration. It made sense for EA Los Angeles to oversee the outsourced project. But while 2015 were more interested in creating the intensity Allied Assault's most famous levels achieved, the owners wanted tradition, a lone soldier contributing massively to the war effort. So ideas like an opening with no firearms were rejected. Infinity Ward were also concerned about their identity. EA was notorious for absolving beloved studios. Even EA Los Angeles used to be DreamWorks Interactive. And according to Zampella, EA were already strong-arming them into toting the flag. The mega publisher knew someone was going to buy them out, and if anyone deserved to oversee these talented artists, why not them? Ultimately, EA's lack of foreplay turned off the developer, and Allied Assault 2 was scrapped. Things weren't off to a good start for the developer. No money, no projects, a lawsuit from their former bosses, and a publisher that'll need a decade to forgive. But they've been through hard patches before. It's been said by former developers that Allied Assault only started to come together in the last 6 months. The bond from such a triumph wouldn't be so fragile. Grant Collier, acting as company president, deployed an industry-wide beacon simply stating that the majority of Allied Assault staff were ready to work, and Activision responded almost immediately. Infinity Ward eagerly met with Tony Hawk's publisher to pitch an FPS depicting modern warfare. And sadly, that's all the information I could find. Grant Collier only mentions it in an X-Play interview from 2007.
Funny story is that we actually pitched the original Call of Duty to be a modern game.
Not in retrospectives, commentaries, files, or lawsuits does this ever get brought up again in further detail, as far as I can tell. Though I suspect Activision couldn't have taken the pitch very seriously. Modern military shooters were setting the stage for the future with Counter-Strike and Tom Clancy leading the charge. But Activision didn't publish tactical shooters, which almost all military games were at that time. They tasted success in Raven Software's catalog and Grey Matter's return to Castle Wolfenstein, but EA took the World War II sales crown in 1 year with consoles, computers, and multiplayer. Activision's envy was palpable. They wanted their own Medal of Honor. So as listed in various articles, but most importantly, in the 2010 lawsuit with Infinity's co-founders, Activision went to Infinity Ward with the idea of Call of Duty, or as it was simply referred internally, MOH Killer. Able to reflect upon Allied Assault's development errors, the team knew this was the perfect opportunity to use mistakes of the past to make something great in the present. And that's what they did. Call of Duty might have been another World War II game, but Infinity Ward's ability overruled any doubt of this being phoned in, rapidly outselling Medal of Honor, much to Activision's delight as they poured a lot of resources to break into EA's territory, paying Hollywood actors and writers, buying ad spots on TV, which for PC games was almost unheard of, as well as pre-assigning Spark Unlimited a console release before Infinity Ward even announced their project. Journalists noted how Activision said it was launching a new brand. Not a game or a franchise, but something they intended to exist for a long time and in various forms. That's when Infinity Ward started thinking about modern warfare again. Even interviews for Call of Duty 1 have developers mention the brand could expand beyond World War II. The co-founders in particular were dead set on moving into the present with Call of Duty 2, starting tense conversations with their hesitant publisher again, when suddenly, Microsoft interrupted. Halo 2's tumultuous development guaranteed the company's biggest franchise wouldn't release a new game in conjunction with their HD console, and Billy's Big Green needed a premier first-person shooter. A sequel to DICE's Game of the Year would be perfect. But that meant revisiting the 1940s. The founders resisted for obvious reasons, but despite their biases, they did see a potential trade-off, as making a next-gen game from Microsoft would come with development kits, making them one of the first studios to optimize their games for the future while breaking into the console market, something Jason West wanted to do for a while. According to Mackie McCandlish, Infinity Ward had to choose between a Modern Warfare PC game or a multi-platform World War II game. Believing there'd be more success investing in consoles, as well as advancing the Quake 3 engine into their own proprietary software, Jason got part of his wish, and rapidly expanded from 25 to 75 employees to accommodate the challenges which laid ahead. Despite World War II becoming a pejorative by 2005, Call of Duty 2 managed to overcome vocal disapproval, outselling the previous game on both platforms. Infinity Ward proved many things in this one game, bringing their unmatched intensity to a new audience while establishing themselves amongst Microsoft's exclusives. The humble studio were greatly respected and known just 2 games in. But similar to BioWare when analyzing the Mass Effect series, they weren't quite mainstream. Call of Duty 2 was a phenomenal game, but it wasn't hype. Bungie could generate more conversation in one trailer than Infinity Ward could with an entire game, and a large part of that stemmed from this pejorative.
When we were doing COD 2, I thought it was a really solid game. All my friends were playing Halo, and I couldn't convince them to give COD 2 a try. And I was like, why? I was like, oh, well, you're this really cool spaceman who's shooting stuff. It's really hard for me to convince them to be cool with like a wooden gun and like a pot on your head.
I don't want to be a private eating dirt on the beaches of Normandy. I want to be a cool guy like a space marine or special forces. So Activision, aware of Infinity Ward's desires, requested another World War II game, and they wanted it by the following year. It was almost as disappointing as it was impossible. The team already tripled its staff for Call of Duty 2, and were now being asked to push themselves even harder, despite outperforming bigger studios in technology, sales, and player retention. Trusting Infinity Ward's ability, Activision decided to compromise and assign Big Red 1 developer Treyarch a next-gen spin-off for 2006. And Activision were intrigued when Infinity Ward pitched another killer project, HK. Not that one. It stood for Halo Killer. Sadly, much like Modern Warfare's earliest concept in 2003, there are no images or design docs available to the public, and Infinity Ward's current developers can't shed light on it. What they did say is with 2 development teams, the bulk working on what was then a World War II themed Call of Duty 3, and a smaller group conceptualizing a total sci-fi with aliens, the studio wasn't maximizing its talents. The team's previous unity had been shaken up with 2 games that were opposites in theme and setting. But things took a sudden turn when Activision did what seemed impossible. They greenlit Modern Warfare, and production positively skyrocketed. The HK team would eventually shelve their work to focus on Modern Warfare themselves, putting the entire staff on board with a project they'd been wanting to make for years, with hundreds of ideas from the cutting room floor itching to be showcased. Even concepts which sound basic, like traveling from one hotspot to another in the same war zone, couldn't be achieved in a World War II setting that lacked helicopters. And by not basing the game upon a real conflict, such as the Gulf War, developers weren't constrained to historical events. An SAS Marine joint operation in Azerbaijan wasn't out of reach. And the challenge of development now came from how exactly to focus their creativity. Development was that of a seesaw. At the beginning, Infinity Ward didn't want the campaign to mirror Call of Duty 2's deafening levels, steering the game towards subdued surgical operations to the point of it being so boring the team scrapped all but 3 missions halfway through: Crew Expendable, Death from Above, and Aftermath. The rest of what's seen came through a new wave, and it wasn't all smooth sailing, with real concern that levels were more Bond than Black Hawk Down. Meanwhile, other stages relied on Call of Duty 2's hectic battlefield design, even when it wasn't believable.
This level has been 2 years in the making. That's no exaggeration.
At one point, you probably killed about 200 guys on this deck.
At least, yeah. It was the entire Russian army.
According to animator Mark Grigsby, the campaign truly came together just prior to E3 2007. It was such an undertaking, Infinity Ward pulled a few members from multiplayer development to ensure its completion. Though even at this time, multiple changes were being made. Witnessing the E3 builds for myself, I'm confident in saying Captain Price isn't actually a Marine, but simply a placeholder, as he also leads SAS missions in the same build. But Gaz was named Griggs, Mile High Club was a real mission, and F&G training was shortened, all of which is before we even get to the cut content. The impression I have of development is due to the bombastic Marine levels coming after scrapping almost everything. The Americans originally played a much bigger role in the campaign, most notably from there being 2 playable characters in this faction, Sergeant Paul Jackson and Michael Carver, the latter of whom featured in several completed and cut missions that involved parabolic microphones, photographing bodies to identify Al-Assad, moving point to point as a sniper, and destroying satellite arrays. Some stages weren't even gray-boxed, but others, like School, were relatively far into development. And luckily, multiple builds have resurfaced in the last few years, and are publicly available to anybody with an Xbox 360 dev kit, if you know where to look. Extremely early versions of Al-Assad's coup, Ultimatum, and the finale are found. But what's more interesting are the cut stages, which even include a helicopter gunship, touring an open-ended level clearing ground forces, anti-air, and enemy choppers, a concept Infinity Ward finally realized in Call of Duty Ghosts. There existed at least one mission where you played as a member of the Russian loyalists fighting ultra-nationalists. Civilians were conceived and coded, but had too many issues to be resolved in time for release. There was a level called Immediate Action, which involved breaching rooms like Modern Warfare 2 to rescue hostages in London's American Embassy. Sea Night Defend involved protecting wounded Marines in a Black Hawk Down scenario, likely inspiring the multiplayer map Crash, as the pre-alpha has that same helicopter. Speaking of multiplayer, it also had plenty of cut content from a dedicated multiplayer team. Matches were up and running 3 months into development, letting the whole staff regularly playtest a large variety of maps, weapons, and modes, with their release date far from view. In early builds, characters can be seen using 2 green perks, which in the finished release indicate a class's third ability, along with said perks like Sonic Boom being added to other categories later. But the most obvious difference are the kill streaks, or lack thereof. UAV radar, airstrikes, and helicopter support used to be pickups available on the map with teams fighting them. Why can only be theorized, but considering Halo's influence, and Infinity Ward's previous dedication to dethrone it, I presume this was their answer to people wanting pickups to emphasize map control, but I also assume this would have turned every match into a game of headquarters, leading these game changes to evolve into kill streaks, and pickups to feature in the old school modifier instead. There were also nighttime versions of maps where presumably night vision goggles might have been required in certain sectors. Seems familiar. The point of showing all of this cut content isn't that this alone is remarkable. Almost all games have enough material on the cutting room floor to justify another game. What stands out about Call of Duty 4 is the sheer ambition and variety of content, which clearly stem from Infinity Ward's creative freedom. 75 people who'd been locked down by a World War II setting, finally unleashing what they've been dreaming up for years, rather than on the spot. In spite of the challenges, there were plenty of laughs and friendly competition amongst the staff, trying to outshine each other's levels so badly that even their PowerPoint presentations became more polished with sound effects and animations. There was real momentum behind the studio, and the sheer amount of work in the finished game and left in development is proof of such dedication. But from all of this content does come a problem. That being how to focus a game which, while certainly not lacking ideas, needed to pace and portray all of these levels in a cohesive campaign that, despite being fictional, must echo Call of Duty's status as an authentic and grounded shooter. And pressure was reduced when the press gave very positive feedback at E3 2007. People not only responded to the modern setting with open arms, but also to the improvements Infinity Ward made to their technology and gameplay. But in all this positivity, and feeling good that the press enjoyed what was shown, Infinity Ward weren't considered a big deal.
I even remember showing up to a single player like launch night or something around the GameStop or whatever.
We were signing posters and
we're ready to sign. We're ready for the hordes of fans to show up. Nobody showed up.
Yeah.
I remember standing with an earshot of two journalists, and one of them said, "Man, I feel sorry for these Infinity Ward guys."
Call of Duty was still viewed outside of the mainstream power trip FPS, and that's because it was in the campaign. And while multiplayer did have the rewarding PvP gameplay that make the series famous, it was limited to 8 players on Xbox 360 and set in World War II, limiting the audience. When the multiplayer beta opened a few months after, that's when the team noticed something was different. The game was picking up more steam than expected. Now even the public were replicating multiplayer addictions the team suffered internally for months. And that feeling only heightened after its release, on November the 5th, 2007. Call of Duty 2 is one of my favorite games of all time. Not just in nostalgia of being one of my first Xbox 360 games, but because of its intensity and immersion that holds up. Even World War II's gargantuan budget and team couldn't match its sense of suppression and survival. However, I've never played the game for more than the length of one campaign, and that's because whether you're in Stalingrad, Tunisia, or Berlin, you're being pushed to the brink. Call of Duty 2 is exhausting to play, and that's certainly not inaccurate to the war it's portraying. But Call of Duty 1 and Allied Assault had pacing. There were moments of quiet time, different combat approaches, and vehicle segments to break up the core gameplay of soldier on the battlefield. Call of Duty 2 lost something in its pursuit of making almost the whole game an extension of Allied Assault's D-Day. And Call of Duty 4 not only reincorporates, but reinvigorates. Charming dialogue using food is reminiscent of COD 2. The extended F&G sequence is much like the original, and the hangar reveals a literally and figuratively old face. But much like Captain Price's renewed character, the tutorial's gameplay reveals an evolution too, with a simple addition: the CQB test. A replayable challenge with target goals that saw many customers spend minutes and even hours finding the perfect route. And it's easy to see why this format became so popular afterward, because giving the player complete agency was something a lot of tutorials lacked. COD 2 very much followed the standard, where you're taught how to shoot, run, and throw grenades in isolation, but are then left to use all of these mechanics together on the battlefield. Effectively, new users are still learning how to play. But by not ending this level at the firing range and moving to a training sequence, it gave players a tangible goal to strive for, even self-imposed challenges within a forgiving atmosphere. Relatively speaking.
Grab the rope when you're ready. Hit the targets! Position 2! Go! Hit the targets! Flashbangs through the door! Position 4! Hit the targets! Hit the targets! Position 5, go! That was an improvement, but it's not hard to improve on garbage.
I can't help but wonder if there was an opportunity to truly mirror the CQB test on Crew Expendable, i.e. letting players solo this entrance. But considering how many times this level was iterated, I believe Infinity Ward made the right call on accompanying all players in this quiet stage. Again, relatively. And let the American stages place them in the heat of battle, which this game elegantly builds to. In core gameplay, you go from training to a tight operation, then fighting on the outskirts of a large battle before participating in one yourself. It's in stark contrast to just one game prior where from the moment your Russian ally opens a door, it's till the credits roll. These large-scale firefights don't blend into each other anymore, and each explores a different avenue of modern combat. Call of Duty 2 didn't have soldiers breaching doors, firing grenades airborne, or as mentioned in the development section, traveling between hot zones. And even stages that do repeat objectives from the World War II games have an increased intensity built in from the real-world difference of every soldier on the field wielding an automatic assault rifle. Dealing with Kalashnikov's unintended world equalizer, it makes al-Assad's forces, despite being outmatched in technology, pretty evenly stacked in firefights due to their numbers. Later games do have these large-scale firefights, but they're of a different kind. Modern Warfare 3's carry the absurd context of Russia invading all of Europe. Advanced Warfare portrays you as a superpowered character. Call of Duty's by no means a war simulator. Your Wolverine regeneration ensures that. But it is far more grounded than its sequels, let alone other big-budget shooters, especially from that time. And it's what retains Modern Warfare's enjoyment in the present. These shooting galleries don't feel as such because while all the Call of Duty games are the same in function, they're not in context. In Call of Duty 4, you're not fighting hordes of enemies because you're Rambo. You're fighting them because it would take this many troops to prevent your forces from steamrolling. It's meant to make you feel like one man, not a one-man army. And that's what so many of its imitators missed. The firefights of Medal of Honor or Battlefield 3's campaigns simply don't match Modern Warfare's enemy numbers, sound effects, and scripting. In these games, there's not nearly enough for the player to witness nor engage in to mask that all you're doing is pointing and clicking on baddies. It is not an easy illusion to maintain. Today, many AAA games are very much based on formulas, 30 seconds of fun repeated over and over and over, likely because the best Call of Duty campaigns require so much preparation that 2 years of development results in only a meager amount of gameplay compared to sandbox and service models, which can be reused almost endlessly. It's been said that Call of Duty 4's levels began with Call of Duty 2's maximum scripting complexity of 5,000 lines, with some even tripling that figure by the end. It's striking how much sound design there is, how many enemies are on screen at once, and how many effects from both the equipment and environment need to be on display, for the level shall otherwise feel static. While anybody can select a difficulty level below their capabilities to make this game into a mediocre stop-and-pop shooter, I'd argue that's not giving it a fair shake. Players should be pinned down by a torrent of firearms, using precise aim and twitch reflexes afforded by elegant controls to weaken enemy forces before making a strategic push. This is what Call of Duty was designed for, and the harder you set the difficulty, the more dangerous that push is. Which brings me to Veteran. Call of Duty's hardest mode isn't taken very seriously, at least today. Not just because campaigns went from emulating battlefields to action movies. Even greats like World at War are infamous for using more grenades than were manufactured during the Second World War. A decade later, and I still call this level bullshit and corkscrew. Starting Modern Warfare, I expected a repeat, and there is a particular level projecting the horrors to come, the final defense of one shot, one kill. Now, combing over the campaign with a keen eye, you will spot overt spawn points, script triggers, and AI paths, but for the most part, the scripting isn't contrived, just breakable.
Contacts northwest.
Safe House had challenges in my playthrough with skipping events, but that's an unintended bug, and the mission Heat recontextualizes this layout with a more elegantly designed sandbox. Firefights are more closely synced to Captain Price's orders, there's multiple pathways and various traps players can set off in any order, making it one of the campaign's highlights. You feel like a Special Forces member in this mission. Not because you're doing some badass slow-mo window breach, but because you're using cunning tactics to steadily cripple an army that vastly outnumbers you. They're not your tactics, though you're still a part of it, and there's flexibility within those orders rather than following an exact step-by-step process. But this Ferris wheel is the bane of my existence, and anybody that's cleared it on Veteran knows what I'm talking about. Context isn't the issue. Holding off overwhelming forces is a solid conclusion for this stage, and harkens back to previous levels in the series. The difference between One Shot One Kill and Comrade Sniper is in the latter, overwhelming forces are funneled through a basement and 2 staircases. Meanwhile, if one enemy reaches the Ferris wheel or concrete barriers, you're pretty much done for. Not only is there little to no cover within these defense points, but there's enough directions and flanking routes that make it nigh impossible to predict enemies. And if you do, there's always the potential to be sandwiched. If you manage to complete this level on Veteran without cheesing the game by camping bumper cars, hats off to you. Doubly so if done on a gamepad, and doubly so if on a Wii remote. Thing is, that's just one section. I did write up multiple paragraphs about no fighting in the war room, but I replayed it and realized why certain encounters were nearly impossible. The level's designed around Soap's M4, not the G36C, which happened to be brought in from my last mission. Replaying with the ability to noob tube hallways flanked on both ends without cover, the level took 5 minutes, rather than 50. Aside from grenades heat-seeking your location, or flinching sights into your nose, Veteran accomplishes the same immersion of Call of Duty 2, maximizing what the series was about prior to this game's sequel.
No one fights alone!
And like any of the soldiers next to you, excluding vital NPCs, a single enemy can put you down, maintaining the game's intensity even when you're clearing rooms rather than navigating a larger battlefield. Most importantly, it serves to contrast them. You aren't entitled to a kill irrespective of how you reach the enemy. Clearing squads can only be done when you've set up the best sightline or exploited a gap in your opponent's defense. Any mistakes during these attempts are immediately punished, and rarely undeserved. Now, when I talked about the Call of Duty series in my channel's debut video, there were a couple of objections laid against this perspective. Mainly that Modern Warfare concludes with your band of heroes preventing nuclear missiles from reaching America's East Coast, to which I say, yes. In the game's penultimate stage, after 4 hours of grounded operations, and even then, the level's opening shows your teammates infiltrating different sectors of the facility. Meanwhile, the sequel has you assaulting a favela almost single-handedly by the 5th mission, something that never happens in this game, even during the finale. There's only one time where you aren't being assisted by at least a fire team, all gillied up and one shot, one kill. 2 levels generally considered to be amongst the best in franchise history from their atmosphere of crossing enemy lines undetected because you're outgunned. The entire objective after shooting Zakhaev is fleeing from a company you cannot defeat, rather than being the aggressor. Not only does this make for one of the most memorable sections of the campaign and gameplay, it serves to contrast the American missions, you being one member of a vast army overcoming their foes by way of aggression, which doesn't even work. The campaign features all variety of scenarios in terms of size and scope, from assassinations in Ukraine to Middle Eastern invasions and joint operations in Russia. But at no point does the game delve into the man versus the world tropes future installments embraced. From the game's 3rd level, the SAS team up with Russian loyalists who assist throughout the game. All the Marine Corps missions feature multiple squads, and all 3 forces team up in the 3rd act. Invading the nuclear facility is done with nearly as many soldiers along your side as in the American missions, which is part of what makes the assault so thrilling. You don't feel empowered as a lone hero, but being a part of something greater than yourself. even the game's final moments where you as the player have fought from FNG to a soldier destined to kill Imran Zakhaev. It's only made possible by Russian loyalists giving you the opportunity. That's not to say I object to power fantasies. This was my 2016 Game of the Year. It's just Call of Duty 4 is a more immersive, intense, and unique game for not following the traditional power-armored hero that was commonplace in 2007. And that immersion isn't just in gameplay. Is Call of Duty anti or pro-war has been a debate for a decade. But I believe a lot of that conversation stems from multiplayer with kill streaks, EXP for kills, and nuclear weapons being the highest tier gameplay reward. Because I never heard a peep of this discussion growing up with the first 3 games, as the franchise was known for portraying war with a grittiness most wouldn't dare. The somber music, allied deaths, grounded objectives, and death quotes all carried a sense of weight. A glimpse into the hell these people went through in the name of stopping a tyrannical leader. But that was always a wall of safety for World War II games. Allies good, Nazis bad. Players don't question war's necessity here because it was the only means of ending the Nazis' power. Though Call of Duty portrayed war's intensity, it had a T rating, and featured the traditional harrowing trumpet wails to match your heroic feats. All of your actions were a net positive, and really, that's the gaming standard. Which is probably one of the reasons why when Infinity Ward first showed their now iconic nuke scene internally, some members said things like,
"What is this bullshit? Well, I get up, right?" They're like, "No, you fucking
just
die."
Yeah.
Like, this is
This is
gameplay. What is
stupid.
this? I can't win.
Yeah.
Like, why do I want to play a game I can't win? That.
In 2007, the idea of players investing multiple hours into a character and military power for zero gain didn't make sense because it's a video game and winning is what you're supposed to be doing. How can we know that? Because originally, your character did survive. This level had full combat. According to Mackie McCandlish again, earlier versions of Aftermath had you exploring the nuclear wastelands in a vehicle jumping out to fight soldiers. So imagine working on this level for months, if not even longer, then being told it's been reduced to a minute-long scene of your character hopelessly dying. I can understand how much of a head-scratcher that'd be at first, especially when you lack its context within the story because that's still being written. But their leaders whose job it was to manage the big picture foresaw the effects of this moment, and how it'd subvert the players' expectations of the Marines, military, franchise, and maybe even themselves. Something else I can imagine is why Activision were apprehensive of Modern Warfare. Not only did World War II have the sales charts to back up its success, Infinity Ward never penned a fictional narrative before. Their games were strings of missions based upon real battles with no greater plot other than beat the Germans. This time, they wanted a conflict with the visuals of contemporary footage seen on the news and internet, wars that weren't so easily simplified, and to have their pillar of multiple characters build into a greater story, as well as develop themselves. The moment Captain Price addresses you, there's a sense he's not only here to cap off missions with a smile anymore, but is attached to your character's progression from rookie to silent hero, starting with a mocking inquiry, one most players probably thought since the opening cutscene, attaching them to the leader in just 2 sentences. This was the work of Jesse Stern, a television writer and story editor during the new wave of levels ordered to piece together a story from them, and used his television techniques but without traditional cutscenes, most notably in cliffhangers. Unlike previous games, Jesse used the level's conclusion to lead into the next, rather than being granted with the option to quit. The level's already being queued with your objective laid out and its atmosphere established. One of the best transitions is actually one of the first. After rescuing Nikolai, the informant responsible for locating the cargo ship, he says the Americans are making a mistake, just before switching to the Marines with gruff officers, helicopter fleets, and rock music, immersing you into this jingoistic ride, ready to bring down al-Assad, despite the game telling you 30 minutes in this is not the best course of action. In fact, returning to that iconic moment, it's rather amazing just how much the game telegraphs it. I mean, the mission is called Shock and Awe, its loading screen has the most foreboding musical score of all the Marine cutscenes, the intro establishes a nuclear warhead's potential presence, and Command plainly spells out your search and rescue is not at a safe distance in the event of an explosion. Looking at this on paper, it seems far too obvious in its intentions, and yet, based on the reaction, it wasn't. And though it's been 12 years and the initial shock wore off many moons ago, there's a slight awe each time I witness Jackson's final moments. Something I think Modern Warfare nor World at War get enough credit for is moving the series from teen to mature. Both games employed an M rating to convey the horrors of war in a manner this series never did before. Even reviewers at the time noted how the world seemed to be in a worse place at the end of Modern Warfare than the beginning. And with thousands killed, a wasteland in the Middle East, and none of those responsible being brought to justice, only their death, it sort of is. But following shock and awe, Safe House begins. Now, I've taken issue with Modern Warfare 2's airport massacre for some time, not because of content, but contrivance, with Russia failing to identify a most wanted terrorist on security footage without a mask, nor his 4 other shooters. But to be honest, when making that debut video in 2015, I just stopped playing COD 4 at this level in particular, because it was 2 AM and I wanted to sleep. Something I regret today, because had I been paying attention, I would have realized how contrived this mission is too. Think about it. Right after the Americans lost 30,000 people to supposedly al-Assad's nuke, Nikolai just gives a ring and says, "Yeah, there was this old house he used before." And turns out al-Assad was there the whole time. Why did we wait on this? Why hadn't we already cleared every safe house Assad had previously used? And what grounds did the US even invade on? Seeing al-Assad on TV? They've got all this tech, and yet one Russian has better intel from memory that only blips after a nuclear explosion. Then again, it took 10 years to get bin Laden, so who knows, maybe this plot point is authentic. However, we established that Infinity Ward scrapped all but 3 levels halfway through development, made a large batch, and then hired Jesse Stern to help connect everything. The team didn't pitch to Activision a plot with villains, motivations, backstory, and lore. They pitched a style of game, and the bulk of development was spent nailing that style, leaving little time spent crafting the actual plot. As late as March 2007, Crew Expendable wasn't set as the game's opening, and it was American, and it was with Michael Carver, the previously cut protagonist. With missions such as Descent that involved identifying al-Assad, and School's objective about pursuing Zakhaev, along with Wet Work and the Chechnya escape it leads into, I can't help but suspect Safe House isn't merely a level, but a summary of multiple stages. The game design equivalent of deleting a page from your script and packing all of its most relevant content into one paragraph, which should be commended. Modern Warfare's pacing is the reason its short campaign was praised rather than discarded. But this quick adaptation led to the ultimate reason not much actually happens in the game's plot, and that's the villains, their lack of development and personality. During interviews, various members were always quick to mention the 4 horsemen.
The story of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare revolves around Zakhaev, who's an ultra-nationalist working with a ruthless dictator by the name of al-Assad. Each of them have a number 2, and together, collectively, the media has dubbed them the 4 horsemen.
But in-game, the only mention of these 4 horsemen is through achievements. Zakhaev's iconic speech wasn't written by Jesse Stern. It was done by Rob Troy, executive producer of the Ant Farm Trailer House, who marketed Call of Duty 4. In fact, these iconic lines were also born from the trailer.
Look at this place. 50,000 people used to live in the city. Now it's a ghost town.
Not only was Zakhaev's one speech written by Troy, it was Ant Farm who cast his voice actor, and Infinity Ward liked him so much, they decided to keep. With this information, it's easy to understand why the game has so little depth in its villains and factions. It's hard to have an in-depth backstory for the game's Russian Civil War when the mastermind behind it isn't given anything more than one scene and speech that, frankly, when Infinity Ward picks up where Ant Farm left off, is quite generic. I highly doubt this stems from ignorance though, and instead a priority list, which is even more evident upon studying the games Infinity Ward produced after Modern Warfare, that to varying degrees of success, all feature an overt antagonist. Even Treyarch iterated upon the villainous trio concept. But while the convoluted plots and devious villains of post-World War II Call of Duty wasn't firmly established in this game, its superb presentation was. Mission briefings are slick as previously discussed, but more importantly, the sound design, voice acting, and music has aged gracefully, particularly the last 2, as those were effectively unaltered a decade later. Graham Revell nor Michael Giacchino returned from Modern Warfare, giving the musical reins to Stephen Barton, a composer who'd go on to reconnect with Respawn for both Titanfalls and Apex Legends, though at the time, Modern Warfare was his first gaming score, but was assisted by Metal Gear Solid and film legend himself, Harry Gregson-Williams, who, like Hans Zimmer from Modern Warfare 2, wrote the main theme as a starting point for their protege. And Steven did not disappoint. It might not have the tear-jerkers and heart-pounders of Lorne Balfe's masterpiece, but each track perfectly suits the scenario it features in. Those repetitive drums are so effective where they ordinarily aren't in video games because there's no barrage of gunfire to drown them out. Letting the beat warn of what could happen, and when danger's avoided, it settles right back into scoring the cold ambience of Chernobyl and its implications. In fact, implication is this game's biggest storytelling strength. Being Price in Chernobyl is powerful because it puts your leader in the same position you experience as Soap, making Price more relatable. Witnessing a president be the victim of a coup in first person sets the tone for the rest of the game that no one is safe. The AC-130 gunship mission is unnerving in its portrayal of aerial bombardment. And that brings us back to where we started in this segment, about whether Call of Duty is pro or anti-war. Because I was seriously starting to question my own comments about this mission being a disturbing commentary when Jason West, Vince Zampella, and Robert Bowling all comment about how cool it is. But then Jacob Minkoff directly referenced this mission as making him feel profoundly uncomfortable, and said it's largely inspired the direction of the latest game. So, is this game's story cool or critical? Is it a commentary or is it isolated? Is it empowering or tragic? Really, I think it depends on the player. What I mean is, if someone approaches this game with only the base assumptions of shooting baddies to stop the big baddie, they're not lost. The game isn't so convoluted or heavy in its subject matter to stop someone from kicking back with a controller in their hands, like previous installments. But unlike those games, Modern Warfare's genuine grit raised questions about war, interventionism, and technological superiority. And while the game may conclude with a cinematic car chase before killing the Four Horsemen's leader in desaturated bullet time, it fades to white and says that everything, even the cargo ship from 4 hours ago, is covered up. Nothing you've done nets any reward or acknowledgement to the greater world. One of my favorite moments is no fighting in the war room when the nukes are disabled, and there's no dramatic camera shots, no ocean blasts, not even a computer graphic. The game portrays saving the world with all the flair of someone's 9-to-5 job, because as far as your character's concerned, it is their job. And I think this argument from Modern Warfare supporting both approaches stems most of all from its creators. Jason West might view the AC-130 from a gameplay perspective of giving epically powerful god cannons after being pinned down by a wall of enemies, or sneaking through forests for hours. But Stephen Fukuda says the level was uncomfortable by design. The team was as varied as the audience who eventually played it, and perhaps that is what helped in the game's success. It's neither schlock nor art house. It doesn't ignore players, but it doesn't confront them directly either. It rode the line, accepting all who approached it. Custom classes, experience points, challenges, attachments, camos, perks, ranks, knives, and prestige. None of these things existed in Call of Duty's multiplayer prior to Modern Warfare. Infinity Ward's last game didn't even have 16 players on Xbox. The jump from Call of Duty 2 to 4 in its features speaks volume to how much it meant to have a dedicated multiplayer development team from the start. 16 maps, a dozen playlists, half a dozen modes of modifiers like hardcore and old school that could combine, along with a progression system that was an outright revolution. RPG elements had existed in FPSs before this. Stalker and BioShock came out the same year after all, and the concept continued with popular games like Borderlands and Dead Island. But in 2007, Battlefield 2142 was the closest unlock tree you could find in a military multiplayer shooter, and that was a team-based game exclusive to PC. For consoles, there wasn't anything else that allowed players to progress their profile in this method, unlocking weapons, attachments, camos, perks, etc., and certainly nothing with Call of Duty's aggression. Halo 3 was the game's biggest competition, and the two were often compared on the uneven grounds that they're first-person shooters. And while it's a comparison I'm not interested in from a gameplay perspective, how the two kept players engaged couldn't have been more different. Halo 3 was a successor of its predecessor. with the multiplayer's engagement mechanisms, beyond its genre-defying gameplay, being to rank up in a variety of playlists. But in Call of Duty 4, even when players were losing, they were gaining experience to level up, on a path to earning abilities, weapons, and in turn playstyles that potentially lead to future victories, or they were close to completing challenges guaranteed to get them to that next rank. And it proved to be hopelessly addictive. While the debate over which system is best will likely run on for as long as we're alive, there's no question which one in 2007 was fresher, and most games including Call of Duty 2 were still following what was the standard back then, quick play searches and/or serverless, with no reason to play the game other than for the sake of it. But Call of Duty 4's mixture of moment-to-moment action with a persistent profile was an untapped market copied at a record rate. Not all games on screen are Call of Duty clones, but there's no question where the idea of custom loadouts and persistent unlocks was popularized. This became the benchmark. Whether your game was first-person in underwater cities, third-person in ancient cities, on PS3, Xbox 360, or Xbox Live Arcade, about aliens in an alternative history, or robots in a retro future. And it's because of this ubiquity that today, Call of Duty 4 systems feel pretty vanilla. Red dot sights, fire rates, and helicopters don't quite pump the heart like they used to. And when the free-to-play Korean shooters this game spawned have improved upon its balanced kill streaks and weapon selection, it's difficult for the inspiration to deliver its old thrills. Though without the initial excitement comes an opportunity to reflect upon Call of Duty 4's success. As established, passions amongst lovers and haters were riding high in 2007. Returning to Call of Duty 4's massively expanded feature set, were they worthy additions? And the answer is, mostly. That may seem puzzling at first upon discovering that all of these perks no longer exist, and plenty of them have a notoriety attached. Juggernaut meant you sucked, Martyrdom made you scum, and Eavesdrop was for trolling.
I told you I was gonna fuck you.
There's definitely some filler. Double tap might have been entertaining, but not only would it drain your ammo supply and magazines, stopping power ultimately accomplishes the same goal of dealing more damage with none of the downsides. But the most notable thing about Call of Duty 4's perks is their emphasis on explosives. All but Bandolier and Bomb Squad have the subtlety of Price's beard. The beginning of any search and destroy round is just chaos. But then I played Black Ops 4, where you're subjected to quick-time events, unbearable equipment, press Q to kill abilities, and it really put things into perspective. The explosives of Call of Duty 4 are annoying when literally everyone is using them on a particular map and mode. Bog and Vacant really brought the worst out of us. But the appeal of Call of Duty 4's created class is the flexibility and creativity it offers to players. For example, as they seem to be a recent talking point, Claymores. In Call of Duty 4, they weren't an instant kill switch, as in so many games, including its own sequels. Their 1-second delay forced players to be precise in their placements in order to earn a kill, accomplished by angling them at 45 degrees, placing them next to cars, or the cheekiest I've seen, firing at them downrange. That is, if you were even using them for kills at all. Many players at higher skill levels still use them even though competitors could dodge the blast in their sleep, because the explosion would act as a sound indicator, behaving as intel in a game where dead silence was a common pick. Despite frustrations, there's a depth to this game's systems that I didn't fully appreciate until recently. Take Juggernaut for instance, one of the game's most hated perks for all those times when you've got somebody in your sights and you pull the trigger just to see that icon flash before your demise. But the perk's effects are directly countered by one of the most popular abilities in Call of Duty's history, so ideally, unless you are following a stereotype, you wouldn't equip this on everything, but save it for classes that benefit directly from it, such as an aggressive auto-shotty setup, and/or for holding down objectives. Martyrdom and Last Stand, there's not really any defense for, especially combined with Juggernaut.
Are you
Though I must admit, these perks might have stood out to me more as a teenager because I was into all the Zerg Grizz montage stuff. Dealing with Juggernaut Last Stand is a lot more annoying when using a bolt-action rifle than an MP5, and the go-to explosive classes which use Martyrdom, Sonic Boom, and 3 frags being so infuriating on Shipment and Vacant is more to do with those maps than the perks. Sure, ripping all of these perks and abilities out of the game would have made those maps more playable, but too much would have been sacrificed. People wouldn't be able to tailor their classes to their exact playstyle, which is what's distinguished Call of Duty. And now that multiplayer games have drifted off to explore other trends, it may become unique again with time. And of course, this was Infinity Ward's first ever created class. Sequels like Black Ops 4 have had a decade of iteration to work with, and they still screw things up. Another thing that's admirable about Call of Duty 4 is retrospectively, its restraint. In one sequel, extra sprint became unlimited sprint. Changing primaries became changing classes, and extra explosive damage became extra. But unlike future games, the perks still retain their significance. Extreme conditioning does make me play more aggressively but not mindlessly, because timing your character's energy leads to further success. It's this depth and flexibility that kept players engaged even after they reached the maximum rank. Modern Warfare does hold up. It's undeniably less polished than the sequels, visuals in general are rather muted in color, and movements not as refined. But all told, people could play this game in the 8th generation with pleasure, and well, they did. I think part of the reason why Call of Duty grips so many is the fact your enemy never feels out of reach. When you face an experienced Quake player, you get stomped. When you meet a Halo pro, they crush you. Meet this guy in StarCraft, you might as well leave the room. There's times in these games where I look at a really good player and think, I can't do that. But Call of Duty? I think I can, even when I actually can't. Because even if that other player is vastly more experienced with quicker reflexes and more precise aim, he's never far from death. One M16 burst, or a few Desert Eagle rounds, is all that's needed to put him down, which feels good. In Call of Duty 2's emphasis on bolt-action rifles, you needed precision to succeed. But with steady aim, grip, and the M10 shotgun, you don't. This is why things like the grenade launcher, martyrdom, last stand, and juggernaut existed. It allowed less experienced players to earn kills in ways previously impossible. They could enact immediate revenge on the person who just killed them, knock enemies back in a satisfying explosion, or survive bullets they otherwise couldn't. This accessibility is what established Call of Duty's reputation of being a baseless casual game amongst agitated fans of more punishing competitive shooters, similar to how arcade racers are written off by sectors of the simulation community. And in both cases, they're missing the point of these and those games. As established, online games always carry the potential of being completely pummeled. There's people out there who endure heavy losses as a learning experience, but considering the majority of people play games for entertainment, constant failure isn't considered entertaining. So when Xbox Live became a viable platform, more games attempted to address this. Halo's was a ranking system, and games today have gone as far as addressing it within the design rather than rules. The reason for so many team-based and battle royale games is that it's easier to accept losses when you're not the only one at fault, and/or what tools are available to you isn't in your control. Call of Duty 4's solution was lowering the initial skill required while giving everybody reasons to stick around. None of these solutions are foolproof, but Infinity Ward managed to motivate more people to play without a complex ranking system which had the flaw of longer queue times. Everybody and anybody could hop in and start fragging almost immediately, which didn't really exist prior to COD 4. Multiplayer was intimidating for newcomers with tutorials, complexity, skilled opponents, meanies on microphones, and for all the tangible reward of nothing. Meanwhile, in Modern Warfare, you could start a simple game of shoot that guy, and the first enemy seen, blow him up, which is fun. And though that player probably hates you now, they'll stick around to complete the challenge for that sweet, sweet red tiger, and get revenge on you to fuel a kill streak. Just like campaign, multiplayer rode a line, in this case with the skill gap, while concluding every game with an update on your consistently developing profile. It's a powerful formula, and with power comes problems, most evidently that there was nothing to prevent skilled players from exploiting what's intended for newcomers. Giving everybody the M16 right off the bat means the richer didn't get richer, but it led to entire clans of camping M16s. One UAV was all it took to then predict one-burst engagements while avoiding the martyrdom and last stand perks from a safe distance. And unlike bolt actions, Juggernaut does little to contest it. There's something we take for granted in an age of character-based games. When one of them is broken, you at least only have to deal with the one abomination. In Call of Duty, at the peak of their popularity, you have to deal with 6 of them. Or worse. You will witness exploits in whatever's the latest game. When I played Infinite Warfare months after launch, 90% of players were still using variants of the NV4. My eyeballs had the AK-74U's outline burned into them from Black Ops. Any match of Call of Duty is only as good as the lobby you're in. Snipers aren't remotely overpowered in COD 4, but you'd find entire lobbies of spinning teenagers, not that I'm guilty, turning what's meant to be an engaging obstacle into a tedious insta-gib lobby, without the fun of actual giblets. The difference is, there's nothing you can do about the MP40 Drum Mag, Richy, or Mog 12, but those snipers, you can counter with Juggernaut Autoshotty. Even the M16 clans could be countered with a variety of perks such as UAV Jammer and Dead Silence. And the cancerous explosives class was most prevalent in modes the game wasn't designed for, which is why I'm not that bitter. While it's true that Call of Duty 4's multiplayer doesn't feature anything mechanically superior, it's remarkable how small the margin of quality is. Modern Warfare 2 has better maps artistically and dynamically, but they're not that much better, and so much of the templates it uses were expansions of what Call of Duty 4 started. Black Ops is a better perk and unlock system, but said improvements to perks mostly stem from what was removed rather than added. Call of Duty 4 being so basic today after being so unique when it launched is illustrative of how gripping its systems and designs were. While I love the dynamic of a firefight in Halo, the speed of Quake, the strategy of Siege, or large scale of Battlefield, sometimes I want to be selfish. Where those other games can require preparation, alertness, tactical assessments, Call of Duty's deathmatch is like therapy. All I need is a loadout tuned to my immediate interests. And the great thing is, if I do want something that requires tapping into areas above the brainstem, those experiences exist too through its variety of objective modes, where those same deathmatch arenas become strategic battlegrounds with their own vantage, flanking routes, and dead zones. And while this formula had been drained, with other games moving to other avenues, it means that many will still be going to Call of Duty for that immediate fix. But even with a new standard, some people want to mess with it. Most obviously, the pros with a background in Call of Duty's 1 and 2, which as mentioned, didn't have any of Modern Warfare's new features. And being that almost all of them were meant to make the game more accessible and flexible, when hosting a tournament for Call of Duty 4, future ESL employee Rob Black cleaved almost everything, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become, as taken up by other developers, ProMod. ProMod is a bizarre beast because it's forever attached to Call of Duty 4 amongst its most dedicated players on PC, and yet I'm sure for many people, even those who poured thousands of hours into the game, have never seen this before. That's because there were really two competitive scenes, Call of Duty 4 on Xbox 360 under MLG, and ProMod under various primarily European leagues. And I said beast intentionally because this competitive mod for Modern Warfare was neck and neck with Counter-Strike's Source in terms of audience, players, and prize pools. So what does the mod do? Well, it restricts you to one of 4 classes, removes all attachments but silencers, discards perks and kill streaks, and removes the muzzle flash. From my understanding, everybody does have the effect of stopping power, and the weapons do feel like that. This isn't hardcore where the game actually gets easier because you only need to be on target for a split second. The mod is instead a template used to set the most even playing field for competitive search and destroy matches, and it is a lot of fun, provided you're in the correct environment. It's unlikely to find the ideal 5v5 core matches if you're just a randy like me, but certain servers will limit the number of snipers one team can have, as were the rules in tournaments. And when you're not fighting a battalion of montagers, it becomes evident why these changes were made. I've played both variants of Search and Destroy on consoles, and while enjoyable, there were certainly a couple patterns, ones that could never happen in ProMod, making the game more engaging. But what's most interesting about Call of Duty 4's mod support is that it in many ways is still evolving. ProMod can represent modding's earliest days, meanwhile today, a group of individuals have taken it upon themselves to create all new single-player missions. I don't know what trickery they're using, but it's surreal to experience brand new Spec Ops style content in a game that never had it. And the most compelling missions are when those modders do things the franchise and all its entries haven't done. Swapping characters in real time during a mission, or hunting for enemies also in ghillie suits are concepts I never expected from a Call of Duty game. Though I'd be lying if I said the mod is of a professional quality. For example, in one of the levels you need to hunt down a fleeing target. Great idea, but he can't escape. He just does laps of the complex. And in that covert mission, the way enemies detect you is of the most binary method. You're in sight or you're completely invisible, and there's no in between as enemies have no memory of where you last were, allowing you to sprint in open fields as long as you dive every couple of seconds. I don't hold blame against these modders though. Even in Vice's article about ProMod, it's mentioned that Activision didn't do much to support the PC modding community. So that they're even able to structure campaign missions at all is an accomplishment. Though if they want to set their sights on a bar of quality to aspire to, then this is it. While hardly a Star Wars fan, I have to admit this mod is badass. Galactic Warfare fulfilled the dream of a fast-paced infantry-focused Star Wars multiplayer game by just being Call of Duty 4 and Star Wars. This is a total conversion mod in every sense of the term, as modders didn't just recreate the perks and kill streaks, but even the ambient tension music played in multiplayer with their own soundtrack. Unfortunately, Call of Duty 4 modding was as inaccessible for users as it was for the amateur developers. While it's awesome being able to join custom servers out of the box, there's no cohesion within the mods themselves. You might start up Pro Mod or Galactic Warfare, but the moment you go to that browser, it's just Call of Duty 4, and without even the mod you've selected as a search priority. Not to mention that every little adjustment made to a format like Pro Mod is considered its own mod, leading your mod selection list to become cluttered very fast. And not all variants are created equal. It's like I walked into a teenager's bedroom. In the end, it didn't even matter to Activision because the company's profits on consoles had dwarfed the PC audience that launched Call of Duty in the first place. And rather than making mods easier for developers and users to expand upon what was shown to have great potential in COD 4, was dropped entirely in the sequel, never to be resurrected, even when Modern Warfare itself was. Call of Duty 4 already had varied experiences amongst its platforms. For consoles, it was an outright revolution. For PC, it was a notable step up. For the DS, it was playable. 2 years later, for the Wii, it was admirable. But 10 years later, with Call of Duty 4 Remastered, it was both the devil and the angel. The former is why what I'm about to say next is likely to tilt a couple viewers, who I can only beg to stick with me. This is one of the best remasters ever made. Normally, these remasters are nothing more than resolution buffs. We've seen this in Final Fantasy, Splinter Cell, and Prototype, though re-releases aren't always so fruitless. The HD collections of Metal Gear Solid, Jak and Daxter, Ratchet & Clank, and many more are a wonderful way to play 6th-gen classics on modern hardware conveniently. And some remasters, like The Last of Us, act as a complete edition, including all the downloadable content not everybody owned, as well as subtle enhancements. But Modern Warfare Remastered's enhancements aren't subtle. Graphics have been overhauled, all new animations are added, the game's opening level is extended to include the cut content. It goes so far as to tie in Modern Warfare 3's flashbacks. It's even bolder than the overhauls made to Halo 1 and 2. And whereas they took artistic liberty to certain levels losing their atmosphere and intent, I can't identify one moment where this game feels like a departure. The most obvious difference is the lighting. Call of Duty 4 carries a blue tint in most levels, but Remastered, likely due to technology, has much warmer, more natural color tones, which I feel suits the game's pursuit of realism in its visuals. Even on an aging Xbox One at 1080p, this game looks downright gorgeous at times, very nearly matching the production of its fully budgeted counterpart. And because the original employed motion capture, the improved graphics aren't layered onto overly stiff characters. You'll occasionally see an NPC or vehicle oddly twitch, but from picking up live grenades to taking cover, these 10-year-old animations ain't bad, even if their creators moved on.
I hate seeing my old stuff. It's not flattering at all.
But while the visuals are absolutely ideal, the sound mixing truly won me over. There are nitpicks. Call of Duty 4's sound design was excellent too, so weapons like the M4, G36C, and Beretta don't retain their punch. But oh man, that shotgun. So weapons vary in the effects themselves, but the mixing has received an upgrade akin to the game's lighting, cleaning up previously compressed sounds and simulating how every element from voices to rockets echo throughout the environment. And this blending of changes and additions all come to a head with the AC-130.
Whoa, that's bloody outrageous, mate!
Bravo 6 will cover you all the way to the extraction zone. You better get moving.
If it sounded powerful before, now it sounds positively devastating.
Copy. Smoke him. Get that guy. Tracking. Good kill. Good kill. More enemy personnel.
This is where I started to feel that someone who hasn't played Call of Duty 4's campaign before should play Remastered if possible, because this sound serves to make the disturbing mixture of apathy, humanity, and destruction even more powerful. That's what I appreciate most of all about Remastered. Its changes are things you suspect Infinity Ward would have done had they made the game in this era. And the best example is the nuke. Where you previously just watched, now your character is active in the moment, trying to save their fellow soldiers and hanging on like there's a chance at life. It gave me goosebumps as if I were experiencing this scene for the first time again. But the horror is fully realized with one simple addition. For all gillied up, the designers talked about how the mission's opening is not simply cool, but seeing your captain decked out gave players a reference for what they look like too. And Raven Software applied that technique to the game's most powerful scene. Developers, this is how you remaster a campaign. And Raven didn't stop there. Because this game sparked Call of Duty's evolution from a single-player to multiplayer franchise, it needed multiplayer, and it does in its entirety. Every launch map, gun, camo, attachment, and perk, even eavesdrop. That is dedication. There is negative logic in having a developer spend their time implementing this ability, and that's why it's fantastic. They understood that Remastered meant respecting everything the game carried. But that didn't stop worthy additions from getting in, such as more challenges, prestiges, and classes to unlock for the game's most dedicated players. Developers, this is how you remaster multiplayer. This is, as I say again, one of the best remasters ever made. Released? You know what's coming next. Modern Warfare Remastered was treading on radiated turf when it was announced to be only obtainable through the Infinite Warfare Legacy Edition for $80 US. And considering Infinite Warfare's initial response, it wasn't seen as a 2-for-1 deal. During the time everybody should have been able to enjoy one of their favorite games impeccably reproduced, only a portion could. And when the game was eventually released as a standalone product, multiplayer featured loot boxes, premium currency, unique skins and characters, timed events, all new weapons ranging from average to terrifyingly overpowered. And the cherry on top of the turd sundae, charging $15 for old maps which themselves cost half that in 2007. Publishers, this is how you ruin your game's reputation. So I stand by Modern Warfare Remastered being one of the best ever made, and that Raven Software deserve credit for their work, but the sheer greed from Activision goes against everything that makes this remaster top-notch. On console, I'd say this game is worth playing, as it's relatively easy to find copies on sale, which is worth it for the remastered campaign, and enjoyable if compromised multiplayer. On PC, forget it. Since 2015, I've analyzed various games that have something wholly unique. Mass Effect's universe, Max Payne's style, or Metro's atmosphere. The gameplay of Half-Life 2 or Halo 2 might have been relentlessly copied at one point, but have since held the test of time from the games of today no longer being like them, even within the same franchise or developer. Retroactively unique is something I've described many games as, but Modern Warfare is the opposite. It's retroactively cliched. In the same manner that a film like Alien has had its blueprint photocopied into enough horror projects that if you've ever seen a space-themed horror film, you've likely seen Alien. If you've played a modern military shooter post-2008, you've likely played Modern Warfare. But just like all other innovators and popularizers across any form of entertainment, that doesn't mean there's no reason to revisit them. For when something or someone is copied, there is always something left ignored. In the case of Call of Duty's campaigns, it was never fighting alone. Using the game's fidelity and authenticity to respect those who served, to let people enjoy and fear its content, to feel empowered and extinguished. Going into this video, I came in with the presumption that Call of Duty 4, while enjoyable, hasn't aged as gracefully as titles I've covered because it, more than anything else I've talked about, became a template for an industry in a generation. Upon replaying the campaign and spending time in multiplayer across various versions, that bias was very much confirmed at first. But the more I thought about it, and in fact as I say this, think about it, Call of Duty 4 isn't just the catalyst for all it inspired. It's an arbiter. It rides a line where everything else, including its successors, nudges or pushes another direction. Titanfall 2, being made by many of Modern Warfare's designers, shares a great many qualities in its campaign. But unlike Call of Duty 4, it's undoubtedly a game about granting the player power in their movement, weapons, abilities, and partner in crime.
The game's about being a badass, not being boots on the ground.
Modern Warfare 2 carried Call of Duty's epic firefights into a fully alternate universe, while Medal of Honor set itself in the reality of Afghanistan's post-9/11 invasions. Some extensions failed, others succeeded, but the point is Call of Duty 4 stands in the twilight of all of them. Where others push for grinding or immediacy, for realism or excess, Modern Warfare stood on the tightrope. When 2019's Modern Warfare was first revealed, I viewed it as an entirely cynical product, and from Activision's viewpoint, I believe it still is. But seeing how much went into this game, was left behind, and subsequently iterated upon through future installments to this very day, it makes perfect sense why Infinity Ward wanted to renew this classic. It was the beginning of an era for Infinity Ward, and only now have all of its intentions been realized, freeing the studio and its members to start anew. This video took far too long to make, and it's all my fault. Making it wasn't a linear process. I paused the Patreon not once but twice as I wasn't comfortable with people donating when I spent weeks lying in bed not sleeping, let alone working. But regardless, I feel like I've gotten over this hump of burnout and imposter syndrome. Everything started to come together in the last few weeks, and I hope that effort and enthusiasm was on display. I'll be posting an article detailing the making of this video and changes I'll be making to the Patreon next year, aimed to give much more interaction rather than weeks of silence when there's a gap in videos. Two people were vital to this video's pre-production and story segments, those being GameBrain and GameCheat13, for the insight they brought to this game's development. Thank you to them, and I definitely recommend their recent content linked in the description. And an extra thank you to Fixed, who I'm officially partnered with. I've been following the record label since its inception, being a Celldweller fan via Need for Speed, and thanks to Voicians, who's seriously the nicest man on earth, I exchanged emails with Fixed, leading to the remarkable offer of having access to a vast selection of their music to be used in my videos. To be clear, this is a partnership, not a sponsorship. No money has changed hands, no advertisements are forced, and most importantly, no creative control is taken from me. In fact, I felt bad because starting a partnership by dropping off the radar for weeks didn't seem like a good first impression. But they've only been kind to me in all my interactions. For the sake of avoiding potential conflict of interest, I'll no longer be recommending albums that Fix produces either in Q&As or Patreon, but you're certainly more likely to hear them, as this agreement expands my music selection massively, which will only make videos better for everybody. That was a mouthful. Time to answer your most important questions. Will you add me on Xfire? Done. When will you actually make a video actually called Raycevick? When I kill this channel? When is Postal years later? When I can imitate more lines than, "Hi there, would you like to sign my petition?" Why is Daka B #1 Siege Doka Bay? Doka Bay, more like Doka bitch. What the fuck is wrong with Sparky? What's your go-to meal? Peanut butter and Nutella sandwich. If you were to choose between two brands, which would it be? Chevrolet or Ford? GT40, Mustang, Focus, RS200 versus the Vet and Camaro. This isn't even a debate. Ford. How important are game trailers? Judging by how different the reactions were between Jedi Fallen Order's announcement and release, pretty goddamn important. I've had developers personally tell me stories of marketing teams showcasing items and trailers that were literally cut 2 weeks earlier. Marketing and development is understandably handled by two separate departments, but a big problem I find in marketing campaigns is a lack of consistency. So often for years later projects, the adverts over a game's lifecycle I see sometimes barely resemble the game they're even being ordered to sell. And actually, Ant Farm and Infinity Ward on Call of Duty 4 is a great example of a good collaboration. Which piece of media are you most saddened by its cancellation, games or otherwise? As mentioned, I'm not a Star Wars fan, but just reading 1313's demise in Jason Schreier's book is enough to piss on anyone's parade. It's equal parts gut-wrenching and inspiring to read multiple developers discuss that even years after cancellation, they'd jump right back on board like a day never skipped if the chance ever arose. Whoever was responsible for cleaving that project, how do you dream at night knowing you destroyed so many?